All right. Well, here's the problem. The problem is Texas applies for admission to the Union, but they're denied. Okay. The Congress doesn't allow the admission of Texas to the Union. Texas applied for admission as a slave state. Now, the reason why Texas was denied admission, there's actually two reasons. One is because Mexico had a large, well-trained European-style army, and the United States had no army, essentially a bunch of militias, right? And Mexico had made it clear that if Texas became part of the United States, that would be a declaration of war. And the United States did not want to go to war with Mexico at that time because they thought Mexico was stronger. Okay, you guys are with me? Questions, comments about this? And they would have been too if it wasn't for the fact that they were in such political upheaval. All right. The second reason why is because slavery is now a polarizing issue in Congress, and it's very difficult to what's the word I'm looking for? It's very difficult to admit any state to the Union, slave or free, because the slavery issue is so divisive. Do you guys follow what I'm saying? So Texas is denied admission for two reasons. One, because Americans are concerned they wouldn't be able to win a war against Mexico, and number two, because of the issue of slavery. Okay, but the way that the proponents of Manifest Destiny explain it is by saying that, well, Texas wasn't ready. Okay, keep in mind that the proponents of Manifest Destiny are saying that the only way that states can be added to the Temple of Liberty is if they're ready. And these people, led by the guy I just showed you here, John L. O'Sullivan, and in fact, this is what he's writing about in this essay, right, is that in 1836, Texas was not ready to be part of the United States because they didn't have the necessary tradition of liberty. Okay, you guys following here? Questions, comments? Keep in mind that every other state that had been added to the Union since the Revolution had been a territory first. But Texas was never a territory of the United States. It was a territory of Mexico, all right? So, or of the Spanish Empire, all right? So Texas is denied admission, but what O'Sullivan argues is that by 1845, they have become ready to be added to the Union. Now, why would he write this in 1845? The reason why is because in 1845, Congress annexed Texas, all right? Congress acted to add Texas as a state to the United States. Okay, and so this article about Manifest Destiny is an argument about why Texas should be added to the United States because they're ready. You guys follow what I'm saying here? Okay, so when Congress annexed Texas, they recognized that there was a difference of opinion between Mexicans and Texans over what was the border. And so Congress did not declare a border. They just said that they would negotiate the border with the Mexicans when they annexed Texas. All right? You guys are following here? Any questions, comments? Okay. So now, what happens is that there's an election in 1844. The man who's elected president is James K. Polk, and James K. Polk was a believer in American expansion. and particularly what James K. Polk wanted was San Francisco. Why would James K. Polk want San Francisco? Remember that the United States is, on the one hand, a trading country, but the traders in the United States are located here in the Northeast, right? And the only way that they can get to Asia is to go either around Africa or around South America. So that puts them at a disadvantage to all the other European traders. But if they could control San Francisco, then they would have direct access to China. You follow what I'm saying? So they want, the Polk wants, and the Democrats, the Americans, want California because they want to be able to trade with China. Okay. So what happens then is that Polk sends a representative, his name is John Slidell, from Louisiana to Mexico to negotiate the sale of California. Okay. Now, let me just tell you briefly about California. California was very sparsely settled, like Texas, or even worse, right? Hardly any Mexicans lived there. After independence, there was a split between Northern and Southern California, and they were fighting amongst each other over who was the real California. And there were a number of Americans that were also moving in to California. And there was a concern on the part of the Mexicans that Americans would eventually take over. Okay, but there was already there were already a large number of people in California who were ready to become part of the United States. All right, and so when John Slidell goes to Mexico City to negotiate the sale of California, what happens is that the critics of the government, the opposition to the government, is going to spread the rumor that Slidell is there to actually purchase Texas, right? And that is such a hot button issue in Mexico City that the government falls. The government loses control, and there's a period of political instability, right? So the Slidell mission actually failed, and the Americans got nothing, right? You guys are with me? But now what happens next is that Polk decides that because there's nobody to negotiate with and they can't buy the territory, they're going to take it, all right? And so he makes plans for taking really all of what we call the Southwest today, right? It was the Northwest for the Mexican point of view. But he sent an army from Texas to the Rio Grande, right? And established a fort there called Fort Brown, which is today Brownsville, Texas, right? And the reason why he did this was because he knew that the Mexicans believed that the Rio Grande was well within their border, right? Because if you will recall, Mexicans believed that the border of Texas was at the Nueces and the border of the United States was at the Sabine, right? And that the Rio Grande was nothing. And so by putting an army on the Rio Grande, what essentially Polk is doing is inviting a response, because from the point of view of the Mexicans, this looks like an invasion, right? And in fact, if you go to Mexico today and you ask them about this war, they don't call it the Mexican-American War. They call it the invasion, the North American invasion, in which we lost half of our territory, right? And you can see from their point of view that it was an invasion from their point of view. All right, you guys are with me? Questions, comments about this? So what happens next then is that there's a Mexican general who crosses the Rio Bravo and attacks the Americans at Fort Brown. Okay, now the Americans were able to actually win the battle, but the news of that attack reaches Washington, and Polk uses that news to demand a declaration of war from Congress. Okay, so basically what he does is he dumps a whole bunch of documents on Congress and says, I need a declaration of war and I need it in 24 hours. All right. And Texas and the Congress didn't have the time to actually go through all the documents. And so within 24 hours, he had his declaration of war. The thing is that like I said, there were people who were concerned that they weren't really being told everything they needed to know, but they were also concerned that they didn't want to vote against the troops, right? They feared kind of political repercussions for being against the war that a lot of people were in favor of. And so the United States voted to declare war. And then later, what's going to happen is that they realize that basically what Polk had said about the Mexican invasion of the United States was untrue. But by that time, they were already committed. So that meant then that there was no way to actually pull the troops back, because if you pull the troops back, then that's not supporting the troops. And you know what happens when you don't support the troops, right? Okay, so the United States is then basically duped into going to war with Mexico. And the United States starts to win a lot of battles right up front. So the United States really pretty much takes over northern Mexico quickly. There's an expedition that leaves Missouri, Kansas, Fort Leavenworth, that marches to California, led by Stephen Kearny, Kearny High School, right down the street from Mesa College, right? And so within weeks, the United States actually already controls everything that they want from Mexico. And so they want the war to be over now, but because there isn't a stable government in Mexico City, there's nobody to negotiate with. You follow me here? And so what happens then is that Polk decides to invade Mexico from Veracruz. All right, Veracruz, if you guys will recall, was the place where Cortez started his conquest of Mexico. And the Mexican army then, led by General Winfield Scott, will march across Mexico into Mexico City. And then on September 14th, 1846, the United States Army enters Mexico City. All right. So this painting here shows the center of Mexico City. It's called a Zócalo. And all these buildings are still there. This is the National Cathedral. This was the National Palace, right? What you can't see in this painting is that the American flag is flying over the National Palace, right? So now you have to consider what you would think if you saw, say, an Iranian flag flying over the United States Congress.
Angry.
Angry, exactly. And this is what Mexicans felt. Mexicans were angry that the United States had taken over their capital, and they're still angry. Okay. Now, Americans will say, well, that was a long time ago. You guys should just get over it, right? But we forgot about it. A lot of you guys probably didn't even know about most of this stuff, right? But the Mexicans didn't forget, all right? And I remember when I was in Mexico City doing research, I was at the National History Museum at Chapultepec, and there was a room in that museum called the Room of the Interventions, and it showed all the different times that Mexico had been intervened in by foreign governments, United States, the French, and the Spanish, right? And I remember them bringing little school kids through the room and pointing out to the paintings and say, look, this is what the Americans did to us, right? So they didn't forget. And what we're going to see in American perception, America's perception in Spanish America is going to change overnight from one of an ally in the Revolution of Liberty to an enemy, a predator that's to be feared, right? So American relations with Spanish America are shaped by this event of the United States invading Mexico and taking its territory. Okay, and even though we go to Mexico and they say, well, we're the good guys, you should like us, right? But they're very suspicious, and you can understand why if you understand the mentality behind their understanding of what they call the North American invasion, in which they lost half of their territory.